This is the Cruciform Conversations podcast, where we explore the healing and transforming love of God and seek to be peacemakers and reconcilers in a fractured world. I'm your host, Greg Arthur. To find out more and engage in the conversation, make sure you subscribe to the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com. Well, welcome to the Future of Faith podcast. My name is Greg Arthur. I'm part of the team here at Future of Faith. And in this season of the podcast, we are listening with great curiosity to the story of faith leaders from across the diverse and beautiful body of Christ. We're looking to understand what God's doing in the world, how are people pursuing their faith, and how can we cultivate the practice of sacred listening in our lives and in our communities. And my guest today is the esteemed Dr. Geoff Holsclaw. I don't know where esteemed came from, but it just felt right, Geoff. Esteemed felt right today.
I feel like I'm full of hot air, is I think what you were trying to get at. Full of steam.
Full of steam, something there. Geoff and his wife Sid founded the Center for Embodied Faith, which is working to anchor the soul through attachment-based, neuroscience-informed, and Jesus-centered tools for discipleship and spiritual formation. I feel like we could have an entire podcast just unpacking that awesome and dense mission statement, but we'll come back to that. Geoff's also the author of multiple books and is a visiting professor of theology at Western Theological Seminary, where he and Sid, his wife, co-lead a Doctor of Ministry program. And he's the co-host of the Attaching to God podcast. And most recently, he and Sid co-authored a new book called Landscapes of the Soul: How Science and Spirituality of Attachment Can Move You into Confident Faith, Courage, and Connection. We have a lot to talk about, a lot of ground to cover. They're doing a lot of interesting things. Super excited you're here to talk about it. But first, we got to get to know you a little bit, Geoff. So,
all right,
here's the compelling question. You're feeling good. It is a beautiful Michigan afternoon. The Cubs are in the playoffs, and you've got a delicious cup of coffee, and you're going to go over to your vinyl collection to throw an album on. Oh. What are you reaching for? What are you listening to?
Let's see. Right now, sitting on the top it's the Black Pumas. Their new album. It's something diamond. But I've also really enjoyed the new album called Manna by Chris Renzema.
Oh yeah,
it's a great album. So I think that's
excellent.
A pull off. So, but
do you actually have Chris Renzema in vinyl? I mean, I stream him all the time, but
the ones I really like, I get on vinyl. And then I just got, and this ended up being a gift from my wife, Sid, who I got the new, it's called The Songs of Surrender by U2, where they reimagine their old hits.
Mm-hmm.
And then she saw that I got it, and then she kind of like stole the album. So now she listens to it whenever she wants to. So
that's awesome.
But what that means is that didn't count against my vinyl budget line item.
Because it was a gift. It wasn't your budget.
No, exactly. Yes.
It wasn't your budget. I love that. Coincidence, I guess, or just great minds think like the Black Pumas are literally on my current turntable as well.
Oh, really?
Literally, that is what I listening to last night while we were eating dinner. So at our house. So there you go. I don't know what that means other than
my turntable's in my office, so it's not really a family activity. Because I listen to them all the time while I'm working. So otherwise, we could put the whole system out in the living room, but we don't.
Yeah.
It's just me.
Ours is mainly reading in the library or eating dinner or like people.
I'm sorry. You have a library in your house?
I do. We got rid of our dining room and just turned it into a library because we have a huge eat-in kitchen and we're like, we don't need this. All we do is read in our family. So let's just put, floor-ceiling bookshelves and turned it into a library, and it was one of the best decisions we ever made. Wow. Yeah. All right. So you've been a podcaster for a long time too, a host of different ones. What's a podcast you listen to regularly, or what sort of lives in your AirPods?
Oh, okay, you kind of got me there. I don't listen to other podcasts, so I listen to not really. I listen to sports radio and sports podcasts. So I'm a big F1 fan. So when I have time, I listen to F1 updates, also Cubs and Bears, sports radio. Since moving to Grand Rapids, my commute has gone way down because the city's small. So I'm like, not really. Otherwise, I'm listening to music.
All right. Hey, that's fair.
That's like the snooty podcaster's answer of like, well, I don't really listen to other podcasts because, So, but sorry.
But really, you should listen to mine. It's fine.
Yes.
But I mean,
you should.
Like, absolutely, you should listen to mine. It's great. That's awesome. Well, so this recent book you wrote, looking at attachment theory and spiritual formation, I think I'll start off. There's no guesswork here. My recommendation for the book couldn't be stronger. I love it. I think it's the most helpful tool of understanding attachment theory on a practical level for everyday people. getting into how it impacts their connection to God. Massive fan of it. And we'll have the links for all that in the show notes and everything. But could you get into some of the background on how attachment theory became so central to the research you're doing, your own faith and spiritual formation? How did it end up being this massive component and a complement to theology and counseling and pastoring and your guys' lives?
Yeah, I kind of fell into it. And for a while, I was like, I don't know why I'm reading all these neuroscience and attachment books. It has no practical relevance to my life or ministry. And then all of a sudden, like everything started fitting together. We started kind of this journey, Sid and I, she started working kind of like on some of her trauma history and some like family of origin kind of dynamics. And we kind of started hearing and learning about some of these people, Jim Wilder and Carl Lehman and others who were kind of bringing brain science in to our spiritual lives. And they were talking about like joy being this foundational kind of emotion and experience of being in the presence of someone who delights with you. And, they'd have a couple proof texts about how it's in scripture, but I was like teaching theology and in a seminary and then also just pastoring in a local church. And I was like, you know what? This is really the whole story of the Bible, is God wanting to give his presence to his people, and that God's presence actually elicits joy in the people who experience it. And when us Protestants often think of like the Old Testament and especially the temple as this kind of like really grim place where the sacrifice is for our sin, that death must be poured out so that we might live, right? But when you read the Old Testament, you actually don't get that picture. You get the sense that like the people celebrate and rejoice in God's presence, that the temple was this joyful encounter with God. And so I was just like using this kind of like basic category of like joy and kind of warms up our brains to be connected with other people rather than stuck in connection. So it kind of helps us promote connection instead of protection, right? And so I started just like peeling back the layers of all that kind of science because I'm a research-minded kind of person, primary resources. And so then I came across like Dan Siegel and Alan Shore, and they were really saying like actually attachment and attachment theory is kind of the foundation of the developing mind, that the way our mind develops and grows, the way our neural circuitry kind of is formed is dependent upon the environment in which that growth is happening. And so it's not just our personality isn't just genetic, it's also shaped by our environments. And then the more I learned about attachment, I was like, outside of people who are in the adoption kind of world and experience that, like Christians aren't even exposed to attachment theory. I was like, there's really nobody talking about this. And the more I learned about it, I was like, this is so helpful for understanding some of the kind of differences we have on our spiritual journey. And so Sid and I were just like, we started training on it. So about 3 years ago, we started kind of doing some online trainings and just talking and raising up pastors, therapists, and spiritual directors. And then we're like, we need to write this up as a book. And so we kind of eventually did that. And, our hope is that pastors, ministry leaders, but just really everybody could start living out of a secure attachment with God and start creating environments of kind of care, but also courage that promote secure attachment. And then if we could do that all around the church, we'd have a different church, and hopefully a real deep transformation would be happening in people.
Yeah. So what with that as an additional tool, an additional lens for understanding God and thinking about how we shape a community, how we read scripture, what do you feel like it's unlocked for you or with the students you're training, the people, whatever, what has this helped them do, see, experience, or cultivate in their own environments in sort of a different way?
Well, I think the language we use is integrating intimacy and independence, and how a secure attachment really fosters both. So a lot of times, kind of a real casual understanding of attachment theory kind of will focus on two things. One will be the relief of distress, that a secure attachment is something like someone who helps you get over the problems that's in your life that you can go to when you need help. And certainly that's super important. And then it'll also be the attachment literature, if you've come across it, is usually around like romantic relationships. So then it's like, well, how do you nurture a close relationship? And those are all great and they're true, but it kind of loses a little bit of kind of this other aspect of the attachment research, which is, well, when you develop that capacity for intimacy, you also at the same time then build courage to go out into the world and to kind of flex your muscles of independence. And that those two things are supposed to go together. So I think what's been surprising is that a lot of people are able to say like this, and we could use the word agency, like they've kind of rediscovered like the good use of agency and how agency can be used to pursue intimacy when it's healthy and appropriate. And then they can also practice their independence in healthy and appropriate ways also, and that those two things fit together. And that really then we connect that to God's being made in God's image, is that we are made to be priests who dwell in God's presence, but we're also royalty, that go out in the authority of God to do certain things and to extend God's kingdom. So we bring it kind of back to the story of Scripture, which is really like an attachment story. And so, yeah, so those are kind of some of the things. We could go back to talking about joy also, but that's just some of it.
No, what strikes me out of that, and maybe connects to some of the future of faith resources and the tools and the studies and the new Faithful Futures book that's coming out, has been trying to understand how listening unlocks things for people in their spiritual growth and in their development, especially amongst youth, that having people in their communities who are actively listening to, validating what they have to say, and being present to them. That there's a significant corollary for that into spiritual growth. And when I read that and encountered for the first time, I kept coming back to attachment theory. That that this joyful presence, this being seen, that this is perhaps an incarnational reality, a fully present reality that that helps people just, it unlocks something for them within that. Does that make sense? Does that connect in your mind too, as far as how you see and understand attachment theory and how it works and listening?
I absolutely do. So if we could just shift, because listening is like a super important word, and it is connected to like dialogue, right? Having a conversation.
Yeah, right.
But I want to take it like down a level. So like in the neurobiology, we could talk about attunement, is how are you attuned to somebody else? And partly I want to do that because it can then go into the pre-verbal kind of realm. So if we were to think all of it, so attachment is about, primarily it develops with the social, emotional, as well as physical bond between a child and a caregiver. Now, how does that bond develop? Well, we could talk about, this isn't in the book as granularly as I'm about to explain it, but it's this process of rupture and repair is really how a secure attachment develops. And so we could talk, because I was raised Baptist, so I got 6 R's here. You don't have to memorize them, but it kind of goes like this. So, and we have to think of a pre-verbal child is something's wrong. They're tired. So like an infant, tired, hungry, the diaper needs to be changed or something, right? So then they cry. And that cry is really, the first R is like making a request. Like you make a request out into the world. You're putting something in the world. I need help. There's a problem, right? So then the attuned caregiver will then, of course, hear the cry and then come to aid them. As the attachment research, as well as kind of what's, I forget who, they call them the baby watchers. There's this whole stream of research that has basically figured out that infants and little toddlers are not nearly as dumb or disconnected as the older psychologists used to think, but they're like super engaged, and they're having pre-verbal conversations with us all the way up like 4 months and later, or even earlier sometimes, right? So the child makes a request. That's the first R. Then the second one is the parent comes and they actually reflect back the emotion that they are interpreting in the child. What does that mean? So usually, and if you watch moms and dads, they'll make a face that matches the face that they see in the child. Like, oh, you're sad, or oh, you're uncomfortable, or oh, that hurt, right? There's between sad, uncomfortable, and hurt, like, and you can all, and if you're watching this or listening, you can kind of imagine that face that you would make if you got hurt. And the interesting thing is that when the child, the infant even, sees that face on their parent, they feel attuned because they're like, oh, that's the face of what I'm feeling. And so they make a request that there's distress, and then the parent reflects it back. And they'll oftentimes then accompany that with a verbal kind of story, like, oh, are you feeling tired? Or oh, are you hungry? They'll ask a question. But that reflecting back, or kind of guessing the state of the child, is super important. And that's a kind of listening. You're modeling a kind of listening. The parent is, by reflecting back. And then, of course, the attuned parent will read the situation, not just reflect back, but actually read, like, you are hungry, you are tired, like your diaper does smell. And then the fourth is that they respond in an appropriate way. Like, so then they solve the problem in a timely, kind of appropriate manner. And then the child experienced or the infant experienced some sort of relief, and they'll communicate that in some fashion, like, oh, they stop crying, or they kind of start cooing, or they make something. And then there's readiness to move on, which is the last one. So that's the kind of the ability to engage in the next thing. So that is attunement. That then is the pre-verbal building blocks for what you're calling like listening. Is good listening skills is understanding when other people are making a request for you to listen. And it's reflecting back the readiness to do that, or to understand what kind of conversation we're having. Oh, this is like a light conversation. We're just chilling. We're kind of, joking, or no, this is heavy. Like I'm going to be like, my body's going to be still as I listen to you. Like you're reflecting back that, right?
Which is also what's the term for the opposite of attunement? What is that?
It would be being misattuned. And the thing is you're never fully attuned to somebody most of the time. We're actually misattuned a lot of the time. And that's why the researchers talk about rupture and repair. It's actually being able to identify ruptures and then work toward repair. That is what makes for good relationships. Secure attachment is basically just layers upon layers of understanding that these ruptures can be repaired. And so when you do this, one, it requires empathy, right? So that the adult is being able to read and reflect back a situation that's accurate to the situation. And so that presupposes, in a sense, empathy. So if you don't have a lot of empathy, you're not going to be able to do that, which then leads to insecure attachment in your children. But then when the child receives that regularly, they start learning, oh, other people can read how I'm doing. And now I'm learning to read how other people are doing. So that's how empathy gets built in. It gets passed on from the caregiver to the child. So what's the opposite of it? The opposite is just
I mean, I was searching for the word, because it feels like being able to identify when we're experiencing that relationally is a big part of figuring out the attunement, right? That's part of the relational wisdom here you're naming, of where the empathy and the compassion come from, is this awareness of I'm actually not fully present and I don't quite understand what this person is feeling or naming, and trying to come back to that place where I am so that they can receive that, right? Like that's the journey of relational wisdom that we're always trying to go and constantly navigating our relationships in times when we're bad at it. And like you said, the rupture and the repair and coming back in. So that active listening and paying attention to the whole person is where the secure attachment's coming out of.
So, and there's two typical kind of ways that this breaks down, right? That then becomes like a chronic misattunement. One is the caregiver who is inconsistently attuned. So sometimes they're really attuned, whether it's infant, toddler, kind of like school age or adolescent, right? You could be all these different stages. As someone who's like, sometimes they're locked right in on you and you're attuned and you feel good, you feel understood, you've seen and helped in a way that you understand. And then sometimes they like disappear, maybe not physically, but just emotionally, they're not there, right? It's very confusing. And so that becomes like a sense of maybe I will get attunement, but maybe I won't, rather than the secure attachment, which is, yes, I believe I will get attunement. I will get, like, people will listen to me, to use that language. This one, and it's called anxious attachment, or what we talk about in our book, Living in the Jungle, is kind of like, well, maybe people will listen to me and maybe they won't. And it becomes a chronic maybe that kind of structures their whole life. And then they really press into relationships as kind of the long-term result of that. They overemphasize intimacy rather than independence. But you get this other chronic misattunement, which is almost like an apathy, which is almost like, I will care for your basic needs, but like the deeper social and emotional kind of needs, you never get that reflected back. And the neuroscience basically says what you don't use, you lose. And so if you're chronically not receiving interactive emotional information from your caregiver, your body and brain just stops pursuing and processing that information. Then it just becomes like very focused on words, very focused on logical linear. And so that ends up being, the path toward apathy. Is I'm apathetic toward you because you're apathetic toward me. And empathy is not being cultivated and good listening skills are not being cultivated. So and we call that the desert, this kind of social emotional desert that you're just kind of hunkered down on doing your own thing. But both of those, the jungle and the desert, kind of can create their own problems for listening. Whereas someone who's in the pasture often gives and receives listening in a very kind of healthy, attuned way.
So one of the ways I'm really interested in applying this and making sense of it is thinking about working with the next generation of youth. I have tried to quit youth ministry for 30 years. God won't let me. I'll be honest with you. I started being like working with youth and children when I was 16. I'm almost 50 years old. I'm still running a community youth group, right? Like, this is just going to be what I do for the remainder of my life. But it's great. I love it. And I'm constantly learning by having to reframe and shift ministry and embody good news for a different generation. Because as soon as I think I've got something figured out, the next group of students comes up and I go, wait, what kind of creatures are these? Because they're rather dissimilar from the ones that I was with before. So with all that lead up, we are just beginning to understand the staggering consequences for Gen Z and Gen Alpha of a disembodied life, of social media, of the virtual world they live in, what it is to constantly have this avatar you're putting out into the world that is where you garner all your attention and your connection from. And there are significant issues at work for spiritual development, emotional development, mental development taking place. How do you see attachment theory and this ability for seeking attunement as a corrective to or as good news for a generation that is lost in whatever one of these landscapes they're experiencing, but whose world has been shaped so that attunement seems almost rare, or the exception?
Oh, yeah. It is
rather than it's not a norm or default in their relationships and lives. So anyways, that's a big lead up, but I would just like to hear your thoughts and thinking about that, especially as we're thinking about next generation and the challenges they're facing.
Yeah, well, I think everything you said is right on. There's so much distraction. They're disembodied, projecting themselves through apps and what that has done, back to these two capacities of intimacy and independence, is it's kind of robbed them of the experiences they need to develop those. So if you think of kids as little scientists running experiments, is they are collecting data like, well, how does the world work? And the data gets kind of put into these two buckets, which is, well, how do relationships work, which is intimacy, and how do I pursue and find intimacy? How do I give it to others? And then you're also getting this bucket called independence, is, well, how do I use my agency? How does the world work? Does the physical world resist me, or is it malleable to my touch? Like, how, and the interesting thing is that play is a great way to run experiments. This is why kids love playing, and they love making up their own rules, and they change the rules. So they're really just gathering data, right? They're running experiments. They have theories. And then based off the feedback of their environment, especially their social environment, their caregiving, their parents and other caregivers, right? Then that all gets developed into these different landscapes. And attachment sciences has so much data about how that happens. But what is happening is, because of all the cultural factors you're talking about, is they're running less experiments with each other in unstructured ways. Like they're not playing together. The physical structure of our playgrounds are actually changing the way that kids play together. And then the fact, and Jonathan Haidt, he talks about this anxious generation, the shifting from a play-based to a phone-based kind of childhood, right? And so we're just getting a lot less data, which means we could say another way, we're not really working out those muscles. And so they're kind of just getting small. So we have kids in high school and going off to college with smaller kind of capacity for intimacy and independence, but they also really want those connections, but they don't know how to go about it. And they certainly lack the confidence. And so I think the attunement and the listening is really a great way to jumpstart that process, is when you have other adults or even sometimes friends who can really listen in a deep way. It starts cultivating those muscles of intimacy and independence. It starts repairing kind of those attachments that I think a lot of times, kids these days aren't getting as much. Yeah,
it just seems like there's some really basic ways that we can demonstrate the good news of this for people who are living in these landscapes. But as I'm thinking about youth or children for whom their life feels like chaos for whatever reason, and that attachment is difficult, that even as we're thinking about ministry or church or families, whatever, there are some basic practices we could build in that would help some of these muscles develop and these skills develop. So what are those? What are some of the ways that we know rupture and repair take place? People feel attunement beyond, like we had this example of the infants and the parents. Now let's think about in a community. You're in a school or in a church or group of kids in the community. What are some basic practices we could maybe try?
Yeah. So what we've done is, I laughed when you were talking about trying to escape youth ministry. I kind of feel the same way. And now my kids are grown, but I still feel like very passionate about kind of the youth. So we've done this, right? So what we do when we're in youth group, I do this with adults, is there's this 2-step, we just call it a check-in. You can call it all sorts of things, where we have people express what they're grateful for. And then we have people check in with an emotion. Like, what's their emotion? We actually have feelings wheels that we pass around. We would do this with youth group or with adults. And then the caveat or the structure is you have to be concrete in what you're expressing, and you have to be concise. Okay, so why do we put those two guard?
Always a challenge. Those are really challenging concepts for people.
Okay, but they're challenging to different people for different reasons, which is why we do both of them. So one, the gratitude one is, so the neuroscience kind of says that, with gratitude, Thanksgiving, and then certainly with joy, that it kind of creates in your body and your brain and your spirit an openness to connect with people. So some people say it kind of turns on your relational circuits when they get turned off because you're in protection mode. So it does all sorts of good things. So cultivating repeated practice of gratitude is really important. So our whole youth group, like everyone to check in, right? And all the 6th and 7th graders are like, I'm thankful for my parents, right? And then it eventually develops into something else, right? And so that is also, if we're trying to be like trauma informed too, you can kind of set that at the right kind of level. So people who have been traumatized, actually, the idea of cultivating joy actually feels like amounts too far, or it even feels threatening because some of their trauma has to do with being abused and tricked, right? That this is going to be a safe environment, right? So joy, so sometimes you just have to break it down to your just basic bodily stasis, is that I have enough water today. I have my Stanley water bottle or something like that, right? So we can go into that more, but there's a way to kind of put this joy cultivation on a sliding scale. But the other one for an emotion is you're really tricking two different types of people. You're doing two different things for different people. So having someone check in an emotion in a concrete way is, people in the desert don't know their emotions. And so just finding an emotion is difficult. And then being concrete about the emotion is also difficult. So that actually pushes them, a certain group of people who have too much independence and not enough intimacy, and their neurobiological chemistry works against them knowing their emotions. So you kind of force them to do it. So that's the one thing, is being concrete. The other one is being concise. Well, you have a different set of people, the people who pursue relationships, who are really good at social emotional processing. We call those people, they're in the jungle. They know their emotions. They know the emotions they had 5 minutes ago. They know the emotions they had 20 minutes ago. They know the emotions of everybody in the room. But when you tell them to be concise, is they actually now have to exercise another part of their brain, which is to focus and to be concrete and to choose one thing and stick with it. And you have to be concise. And that's actually develops the other kind of part of you. So being concrete and being concise is a practice about your emotions. This is a practice that kind of develops you, that leads you over time into more of a secure attachment kind of integration of these things. Just to tell a story to show that this kind of works, is we've been doing this for a couple of years in a youth group. And then as one of the check-ins, one of the boys, and it's important that it's a boy, he checked in about being bullied. And when he said it out loud, he burst into tears. And the youth group immediately surrounded him and started praying for him and accepted him for the expression of his emotion. There was no teasing. There was no shaming, because they were already used to an environment where positive and negative emotions are contained in this environment. We listen to each other and we let you be the way you are. You can come with whatever emotions you have, and we can all hold that together, is the environment that we had. And so I just felt really proud of the group that they were able to respond to an 8th grade boy who burst into tears because he was being bullied, which is normally a very vulnerable situation and one that you could be endlessly teased about. And that never happened. So
that's amazing.
So that's the story. I might have given you too much there.
No, it's perfect examples, because we focus a lot on sacred listening tools, like actual ways of take the concepts, just live them out. And I think what you just named about these check-ins and how they work is really helpful. And I have some follow-up questions. A youth group I've been in, we've had some similar practices for a number of years. I'll give a shout out to my friend Jason, who gave us the term, we use our happies and crappies. That was our middle school check-in, right? The happies and crappies, right? Of thinking about that, and the concrete check-in. Give me, listening to it, the question that emerged from someone's going to say is, what is a concrete emotion check-in? Like the concrete example of like something I'm happy for, my Stanley water bottle. I've got an iced coffee right now. That is what I'm thankful for. That's concrete. What's the concrete emotion? How do you describe that? Or what are the guardrails for people about what that is?
I think it's connecting it to like an experience as best as you can, connecting it to an experience if you can. Okay. So like I'm glad that I got a good grade on the test that I worked really hard for, or I'm sad because my grandma died.
Gotcha.
So just trying to kind of create
You're connecting
those bridges.
it to an actual moment, event, experience. That's what makes it the concrete part, not just a general malaise, right? I'm feeling sad. Why? I don't know. We're trying to identify what is it connected to, what is it rooted in, and that helps.
Right.
That helps them express it, but also just sort of how to be present to what they're actually going through.
Right. So because somebody with like the avoidant attachment strategy, or what we call the desert, they're going to be disconnected from their emotions generally. They won't want to share them even if they know what they are, right? So it's all just too vulnerable. And so you kind of need to kind of give them that, like, you can do it. Someone in the jungle, or sometimes called avoidant attachment strategy, right? And I have people in my head, they'll just want to tell their whole day. They'll want to share their entire day. And, they'll start off the whole thing, and then all of a sudden, and I'm sad. And you're like, we didn't even hear the sad part yet. You talked for 7 minutes,
Right.
And so it's helping them kind of be like, I had a pretty good day, but right now I'm upset because something happened in my family right before I came here. It's like, okay, thank you. Right. And so just kind of helping them do that. We can't go into all the kind of research, but like, you're training the brain to do all sorts of things and integrating kind of systems that oftentimes get disintegrated or don't work together.
Yeah. That's really helpful. So you're getting to, and I know you're like me, you are nerding out on this stuff continuously. You're always reading, you're gathering information and data from everywhere you can. But you also have this really interesting experience now where you're leading these doctoral cohorts and getting to interact with people who are doing their own research, doing their own projects, their own ministry experiences, whatever it is within that. What do you learn from listening to your students? What insights, what new ideas are you encountering through your program?
Well, we're just starting the process of them working on their projects. So I'm like actually really looking forward to all the stuff I am going to be learning from them. So we haven't quite got far enough along. I'm still kind of just grading some of their papers, and we're talking about their projects, but there's a bunch of just, really interesting and compelling ones that I'm really excited about. One is we have actually a comedian who's a pastor who's a part, and he's talking about the neuroscience of comedy and how that needs to be brought into spiritual formation more. We have one who's looking at ADHD and the Desert Fathers and asking whether the spiritual practices of silence and solitude and fasting, like how does that fit in with neurodivergent people? So we're super excited about that. I could just kind of go on and on, but I think our hope is to kind of create a body of knowledge, for all of us, which is something like God made our bodies, in the last 20 years, like the neuroscience, especially the interpersonal neurobiology and how all this fits together, has just kind of changed how we think about medicine, psychology, attachments, and relationships, which has been great. So how can we take all that goodness and then also take both, scriptural truth and the wisdom of the spiritual tradition and help them interact in a way that kind of helps us all move forward? And the kind of the stories that I was just talking about youth group, like that's what we hope to kind of replicate all around, where we can just take like the best of this knowledge and help not just youth, but adults, and kind of take the next faithful step forward.
Yeah. So let's just make it real practical. Then I love the fact we've actually gotten into some, you and I can tend to drift off into science and
never.
But we've gotten into some really good, helpful, practical things today. Somebody's listening to this and they're thinking, okay, I'm a leader in a community on some level. I'm thinking about how we integrate this and how we begin to think about this and be attuned to this for our people. Where do they start? What does it begin to look like to just begin to cultivate some healthy practices and not, rush ahead to we're gonna fix this. We're gonna have an incredible community of attachment right now. But where's someplace they can start?
Well, I would always say like integrate. I think a lot of times churches don't need to burn down everything they're doing and then start over and do a whole bunch of other practices. It's more of just intentionally integrating often the things that you already do. So the first one would just be gratitude. And so Sid and I, when we're pastoring, youth group, all sorts of things, just having gratitude check-ins, helping people check in and be honest. What are they bringing into this moment, right? So you can do that in different ways at staff meetings. You can do that in small group settings. You can do that in corporate worship settings. Is just acknowledge and or create space early on in the meeting or the worship time, worship service, of just acknowledging, cultivating a little gratitude, and also acknowledging that we're all bringing different emotional states into this corporate event and just allowing that to be okay and acknowledging it. And then after that is, and I always think of kind of these two, this is an oversimplification, of course, but like we process reality in two ways generally. One is the social emotional processing, the affective processes. So that's the embodied, nonverbal kind of way of being with other people. Then you also have the logical, linear, and primarily linguistic, right, side of things. And people have different competencies on both those things. So if you just want to take an example, like you could just think of the repetitive emotional worship chorus and the really doctrinal hymn, right? Those are getting at different, one's the social, emotional, affective processing. The other one is kind of the logical, linear, right? And so are you creating, whether it's just the worship service, but are you kind of cultivating both those things in all your environments? Chances are you probably are. Maybe sometimes you're lopsided, right? So how can you, so I'm at primarily like a charismatic vineyard church, so we really press into the intimacy and the choruses, so I'm always the guy when I lead worship, I'm bringing the hymns in, right? But other churches are the other way. It's all hymns. And, we look down on those emotional courses, right? And it could be in your preaching. It could be in how you lead small groups and what kind of curriculum you pick or what books of the Bible you go through, right? So are you getting in a rut that's all like social, emotional, and or are you getting in a rut that's like very doctrinal, logical, linear? It's mostly, you don't need to burn everything down and start over. But how can I just take these two God-given ways that we process the world? You could call it left brain, right brain, but that could be a little, but like, how do we bring this integration in is kind of what I would want to encourage people.
Yeah, no, I think that's a really helpful picture you've given us to be able to go back to our communities and think about, okay, what are we good at? And that's a strength, but how do we balance it with maybe what we're not as intentional with, or we just don't create as much space for? And how do we, attune to our people that are there in our communities and what they're going to need and how they're going to process this and working through that. So that's super helpful. We're going to have a bunch of notes and links to accompany the podcast, but I know people are intrigued. They want to connect with what you're doing, where they're going to find you. How do they connect with you?
Yeah, well, we just started the Center for Embodied Faith. And so you can find that at embodiedfaith.life. There, you can get connected to our book, Landscapes of the Soul. We also do 6-week trainings on attachment stuff. And then you can find a link to our podcast as well as my Substack is on there. We're hosting a summit. So yeah, embodiedfaith.life is where you kind of get all this stuff.
Yeah, I was really excited. I got an email today in my inbox about the summit. Give us a quick blurb and commercial for the summit because it looked excellent.
Yeah, so the idea for the Attaching to God Summit is to bring 3 groups of people together. So we have speakers who are therapists and counselors who come on one day. We have biblical scholars and theologians who are focused on the second day. And then we also have like pastors and spiritual directors, and we're trying to have this conversation. So we just had the broad topic of attaching to God last year. And this year we're focusing a little bit to how do we cultivate intimacy and independence as the 2 God-given kind of aspects of being made in God's image. So intimacy and independence as kind of the on-road towards secure attachment is what we're focusing on. And so it's a free online summit. So it's in October 14th through 16th. All those videos will be open and free during those days.
Fantastic. We will make sure that people can find that and get to participate. So Geoff, thanks for helping us think about all of this in a way that's helpful and practical. I'm very proud of us for having found some actual practical tools and steps for people to get engaged with this. So I feel like mission.
Well, I know you.
Good job.
I know you know this, but we struggled really hard to make the book very readable and very practical for anybody. You don't have to be a theologian or pastor to kind of grasp landscapes of the soul.
No, and this is where I really applaud you. I think you guys did an excellent job of that, and it is very attainable for people. And I think just really, really helpful. So well done with that. And certainly thanks for coming on here and sharing about it. We'll make sure people can find you online and get connected with your stuff. So appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Cruciform Conversations. Be sure to subscribe to the podcast on Spotify, iTunes, or YouTube, and to visit the Cruciform Reflection Substack at drgregarthur.substack.com.